Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Samuel Gunter.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you are all having a good day. You're enjoying the turn in the weather being a little bit cooler, and I hope for those of you out west that you have got access to safe shelter. We're going to talk a little bit about Hurricane Helene, as we have been doing for the last 2 weeks, and dive in a little bit on that and do some scattered updates from local, state, and federal as well. So let's dive right in. As always, it hasn't been that long, but we've been talking about on this call compiling resources on our website, and that's everything from the big ticket items to like FEMA individual assistance and the hotlines there, all the way down to the waivers and some of the things that are happening administratively behind the scenes for a lot of housing programs and others to reckon with the disaster that is Helene and all of the adjustments that we need to make to respond. So you can find that link in the call notes. If there are things that aren't on there that you see that we should put up, things that you have going, we have also a link there to submit to us to make sure it gets up there. You can also just email us at info@nchousing.org. Part of what we're trying to take stock of here at the Housing Coalition, obviously we're not engaged in like the immediate term rescue efforts in a direct way, but a lot of what we have had our eye on in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew, in the aftermath of Hurricane Florence, and now in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene is what long-term housing recovery looks like. And as we've experienced, that is a years-long process. And we were challenged in the aftermath of Matthew and Florence because we didn't have an infrastructure in place at the state level. We have an infrastructure now, and trying to make sure that that infrastructure has the information that it needs, that the resources that exist are connected to one another and are flowing in a timely manner. And so that requires a lot of communication. And so if there are things out that we're putting out there that are lacking, let us know what we're lacking so we can get it up so that we're all working from the same sheet music. A couple of items, updates on numbers. This is from the Housing Recovery Support Function meeting last Thursday. Some of these numbers will have changed, but this is what I have in all of these categories for right now. But as of Thursday, more than 143,000 people had signed up for FEMA individual assistance, which is well beyond where we were at this point in the aftermath of Hurricane Florence. But of those 143,000, only a little over 1,200 families had checked into temporary shelter assistance placements. It's around a little over 3,000 people. And for temporary shelter assistance are, your home is uninhabitable, and FEMA contracts with hotels to house people temporarily while they figure out what a long-term housing plan looks like. So at the moment, or as of Thursday, we had more than 1,200 families checked into hotels, which feels low. And I think the reality for a lot of folks is, and I know this is true for our staff, as well as others from sister organizations who are either based out west or have staff out west, that even though there may not be running water, it's not like you can take a hotel placement a state over and still get to your work. And so it is a challenge in terms of housing stock and the ability to house the folks out there. We're seeing this in terms of the volunteer organizations active in disasters as well, that they are having challenges housing volunteers who want to help with relief efforts, right? The stock is just not there, and it is inaccessible, and there's no water, and on down the line. At the moment, 16 shelters are open, serving 169 people who were experiencing homelessness before the disaster, and more than $69 million has been distributed in disaster recovery benefits as of Thursday. At this point, several disaster recovery centers should have opened. Buncombe was already open. McDowell, Caldwell, and Jackson counties should have been open. I'm not going to go into all of the stuff that is happening around potential threats being issued to folks working with FEMA out west and what that's doing. You can look all of that up in the news if you want to wade through all of that. But several of the disaster recovery centers are up and running at this point, and more will be open as as they clear the space to be able to have them. One of the other big items that has taken a lot of my bandwidth over the last week has been the courts reopening. There were 40 evictions on the docket in Buncombe County yesterday, 22 in Henderson County. Members of the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network have been pushing the governor's office as well as the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court to put a 90-day pause on evictions in the disaster-impacted counties, as there's nowhere for folks to go right now. As I just talked about with temporary shelter assistance, right, and the choices that families are making about the habitability or inhabitability. I'm going to, you know what I'm talking about. Can you live there? Can you not? Right? You may not have water, but you can't travel 200 miles to get to work, and you still got to work. So folks are making a lot of decisions based on the crisis of the moment and how to weather it for their families. We just don't, forget whether or not bills are being paid at the moment. There's just nowhere for anyone to go. And I think it's critical, especially now. One of the other things that we've been hearing a lot, I've heard it from a couple of elected officials at this point who have kids at App State or other places in the West. I've heard it from some of the calls coming through Legal Aid of North Carolina and Fiscal Legal Services about folks who are unable to access their housing yet, who are renters, who are unable to access their housing because of the disaster, and yet are still being asked for the rent on time. And to clarify, there is no legal option for tenants in North Carolina to withhold rent, and landlords are within their rights to demand it, even if the housing is inaccessible in the aftermath of a disaster, which is wild. But that is the landlord-tenant law that we live with in this state, and which is why I think it is absolutely critical right now, especially in a disaster, to put a pause on evictions, both because there's nowhere to go and with loss of employment and loss of access to housing for a number of folks, it is unconscionable that you would evict someone under these conditions. So if you're interested in being part of that effort, there is a letter that this group of organizations as part of this Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network have signed and sent to the governor's office, copied the Chief Justice as well. If you want to be part of that effort, reach out. You can find the letter linked to the call notes as well. A couple of other items on Helene. HUD had announced funding to support people experiencing or at risk of homelessness in North Carolina. This is the RUSH, is the acronym here. RUSH grants is $3 million. This is, it's of note, it's $3 million, which is, it's an award, right? Again, in the world of housing, $3 million is not huge, but I think what's of note for this program is it is targeted to folks already experiencing homelessness. And it is this federal program was birthed out of Back at Home here in North Carolina. It was kind of the brainchild of Representative Price, and was inspired by the efforts in the aftermath of Matthew and Florence for the Back at Home program here in North Carolina. So it's a new federal disaster recovery program targeting folks experiencing homelessness that was designed after some of the work that has happened in this state over the last couple of years. But those dollars were announced, and they're issuing more than $3 million grants. The award comes in $3 million tranches, so that's the max that you can get in any one allocation, and there are potentially future allocations. You can learn more about that in the call notes. As a reminder, Congress at the moment is in recess until after the November election. There has been a lot of talk about whether or not they need to come back before November 12th to do a disaster supplemental allocation. At the moment, Republican House leadership is saying that the federal agencies have enough money to handle recovery efforts for Helene and Milton until they return on the November 12th. Federal agencies are saying that that's going to be rough, and folks on both sides of the aisle are raising concerns. I've been speaking with quite a number of our delegation over the last week and a half, but in particular I spoke with Senator Tillis' office last week, and the particular Small Business Administration funding and the disaster supplemental are 5-alarm fires right now. We got two major disasters running at the moment, and our resources are stretched. So that is something that is kind of in terms of the DC environment and what's happening. We're also beginning to talk with folks not only about CDBG disaster recovery allocation and what that looks like, but also what did not happen after Hurricane Florence, like happened after, say, the wildfires out in California, was we did not get a disaster allocation of low-income housing tax credits. So there's already talk here in North Carolina, as well as in Tennessee, Georgia, and Kentucky, and I am sure in Florida as well, about getting to our delegations to secure a disaster disaster allocation of low-income housing tax credits as we think about rebuilding. So there's nothing linked in our call notes about that, but as we move forward in the coming 2-3 weeks, we'll get out more details to you about what that looks like and if you're interested in being part of that advocacy. The only other thing, on Helene at the state level that I want to update you on right now is that lawmakers passed the Disaster Recovery Act here in North Carolina last week, among many other things, including flexibility in elections, administration, and relaxing restrictions around burning debris and a whole bunch of other things. There were $273 million that was allocated to recovery efforts. Most of that, $250 million, the vast majority, was matching funds for North Carolina emergency management and federal disaster assistance. There was also some money in there to pay school employees as even if school isn't able to be back in session because there's no water to the buildings, and some TA money for local assistance on how to manage recovery funds and so on, but the bulk of it was in the emergency management match. What was missing there is language in particular authorizing the Office of Recovery and Resiliency to begin some of their efforts, which is going to be a high priority as we get to what will be another bill in the near future. What is different now in the aftermath of Helene than the aftermath of both Matthew and Florence is we have an Office of Recovery and Resiliency. We have a disaster recovery office that is tasked and staffed with folks who do long-term disaster recovery. We've learned a lot of lessons trying to build a recovery infrastructure in the midst of two historic storm recoveries that we are ready to as a state, put into action. One of the pieces that is different now as well is we have data sharing agreements in place already. So the handoff that between what FEMA does in the immediate aftermath of a storm and what transitions to HUD and the long-term housing and disaster recovery infrastructure, that handoff is hopefully going to be seamless this time around. The case management will be seamless this time around. In what will be, I anticipate, a much longer recovery given the very intense infrastructure and transportation challenges associated with rebuilding in the West, given the topography and given the impacts on roads and water systems and so on. We'll be talking more about that and what role you could play in advocacy around the General Assembly as we know more. Moving through things that are not Helene related, a couple of things around the state, and we're coming close to time, so I am just going to hit some very big highlights, and the rest you can find in our call notes. We got several articles about from Raleigh News and Observer, from Transylvania Times, from USA Today, from Fayetteville, Greater Fayetteville Business Bureau, New Hanover County, all about local efforts and questions about funding for housing, what the impacts are for folks on the ground in the aftermath of Helene, what some of the long-term housing impacts might be. There's a number of articles there that I think are worth mentioning. A couple of events that we want to let y'all in on. HUD is hosting a webinar on October 16th called Our Places of Impact, Self-Care for Community Development Professionals. The APA of North Carolina, the Association of Planning, excuse me, the APA of North Carolina Fall Conference is October 16th to 18th in Greenville, North Carolina. Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies is hosting a webinar on the role of public housing in a new social housing system. I think it's going to be a really interesting webinar for those of you engaged or who touch public housing in your communities. There's also another one that they're offering on the 1st about called The Decades Ahead, Projecting Household Growth and New Housing Demand in 2025 through 2045. There's a couple of other ones on here. Also, save the date. National Low-Income Housing Coalition is having their policy forum March 24th through 27th in D.C. next year. A couple of other reports. Urban Institute has a piece on how North Carolina can address their housing challenges after Helene. NLIHC has a piece on combating misinformation. And Center for American Progress is a piece on Americans recognize housing affordability crisis and support new policies to fix the market and build more homes. So a number of items in the national news that I think are worth taking a look at, but that is that's the roundup for housing policy this week. Again, if you go to our website, see the resources that we're highlighting in the aftermath of Helene, please take advantage of those. If you see any gaps, please let us know. And if you're interested in getting engaged on the advocacy around Helene disaster recovery, particularly around the eviction moratorium right now, reach out. We look forward to having your voice engaged in the effort. Thank you again for joining us, and as always, we'll see you next time.